World markets plummeted on Thursday, their biggest drop in more than a month, sparking fears of a double-dip recession. And this comes after a series of grim warnings over the global economy. The US Federal Reserve has warned the American economy was facing significant risks, while in Europe, the International Monetary Fund said the fiscal situation was entering a dangerous place. And to get more insight on the story, let's now talk to Margaret Bogenrief from crisis management firm ACM Partners. Margaret, thank you very much indeed for your time. So this is the biggest drop in more than a month, and the forecast coming out from the IMF and the Fed is not quite bright. So does it mean the second dip recession is just around the corner?
Well, let's take a look at what happened in the world markets generally. So you saw the Dow was down approximately 3.5%. The NASDAQ, S&P, same thing. Europe got hit even harder. Generally across the board, with a few exceptions, the European markets were down about 5%. Now, what does that tell us? Is a double-dip recession looming? No, I actually think it's here. And I actually think the fundamentals driving it have been here for a while. I would argue since 2008. Unfortunately, the markets have taken any kind of sign of good news or any kind of policy indicator to think, oh, this is the magic bullet that's going to save us. And you've seen trading kind of reflect that. Here's the issue. Whatever you want to say, whatever you want to call it, the global economy has semi-permanently contracted. And frankly, the faster markets come to understand that, the sooner recovery can begin.
So is that because the US and Europe both have huge debts? Is this the main reason the ship of the global economy is sinking, so to speak?
Absolutely. I mean, let's take a look at both the United States and Europe for, I would argue, between the past 10 and 30 years. Of course, it differs kind of depending on what region you're discussing. Debt-fueled growth is a great story. It's a great political story, and it's a great economic story. Debt is cheap. It fuels growth. It makes us all think we're growing more and we are doing better than we actually are. What you're coming to see now is the economic chickens and roosters are coming home to roost. What you're seeing with the US and Europe, and one of the things that's so frustrating is I think the markets took a long time to see this, we're not able to pay our bills anymore. So you're going to see a pretty strong contraction, and that will undoubtedly affect the rest of the world. I mean, we are the leading markets of the world. So yes, I would absolutely argue those have been significant driving factors of this crisis.
World Bank President Robert Zerlich said advanced countries needed to act quickly to resolve their crises before they ravage the rest of the global economy. This is despite the fact that the world leaders have been working to prevent another world recession from happening. Does it mean their efforts are leading us nowhere?
Well, I think what's interesting to think about is let's look at this crisis through three separate prisms. I'd say there's an economic one, a political one, and a policy-driven one. So what does that mean? Economically, the markets, investors, people playing within the financial space need to understand there's no policy-driven economic magic bullet that's going to save us. So the faster the markets acknowledge that, the faster we can kind of put a clamp on this, contraction of the world economy. Now, let's take a look at the political sector. Voters across the board, both in the United States and in Europe, need to understand we aren't being rescued. I hate to sound grim, and I hate to sound like, the person screaming from the financial mount that everything's over. But the sooner we acknowledge that, and the sooner voters understand that no matter what politicians say, there's no policy fix for this, that will slow down this crisis. And finally, let's look at the policy side. Let's take a look at Greece, particularly, and the players within the European Union more broadly. So take a look at Greece. If 6 months ago, when I would argue the financial writing was on the wall, these leaders took a look at this and said, okay, we've got to either fix this or get out. And I would argue getting out has always their decision. Think about how much money would have been saved. Think about how much money would have been pulled from a sinking ship that is inevitably going to sink and be put back into buttressing German base, fixing French infrastructure. But again, the policy leaders were so, forced to adhere with the political forces and voters were saying, along with what the markets were saying, that everyone kind of interacted in this terrible, perfect economic storm that's resulted in the crisis that we see today.
Also, Asia was touted as a locomotive of world growth, but it has also plunged. So whom should we now look to as a model of growth then?
See, I'd actually argue looking at any given country or any given region as a locomotive of economic growth is really disastrous as well. Obviously, there are specific cases where you say, oh, this country is growing because of a commodities price shift or something like that. But I think generally what you're asking and what a lot of investors ask me is, well, what about China? China is growing. That seems to be the great growth story of, the past decade and this coming one. Here's the thing. Look at China and look at a lot of sort of growing economies. A lot of that growth, particularly in China, is tied to first world developed countries' consumption. So what do I mean by that? We built up economies. We had more money to spend, at least on paper. We bought more stuff that they were producing. Well, China and a lot of other Asian countries aren't going to shrink as drastically as the United States and Europe will. They will still shrink. They have to. There's just less money for us to buy stuff. So I think anytime you start looking at, whether it's Latin America, the BRIC countries, any of those as the growth stories, always read between the lines, because no matter what country you're looking at, they can't decouple themselves from this global crisis.
All right, Margaret, thank you very much indeed for that insight. That was Margaret Bogenrief from ACM Partners.
Thank you.